All right, it's time for us to talk about the English language in America. Now, of course, the English language traces its origins in the United States back at least 400 years to the arrival of English-speaking settlers in the Atlantic coast. And this map shows you, though, that it was not just English people coming into the eastern, what was to be the United States, and what was then the British colonies during the early days. The green on the map, this sort of turquoisey kind of green color, indicates English settlements, people who came specifically from England, but also from Wales. But we also had a substantial number of Germans arriving. A lot of them settled in Pennsylvania and some in New York. And of course, this pink strip here up the Hudson River Valley in New York was a Dutch colony up until the 1660s. And we still have a number of Dutch words that have come into English through that colonial period in New York, when New York was New Amsterdam. So if you've ever sat on a stoop instead of a front porch, that's a Dutch word. The Dutch have also given us delicious words like waffle and donut and cookie. Go Holland. And also, the word Yankee is sometimes surmised to be a Dutch word. And it was a word that it's related to the name John. And it was, I think, I'm not really sure how, but Janke was a kind of diminutive form or a pet name like Johnny or something like that. And somehow it was applied to people who were Dutch. And so people who English people called the Dutch people Janke or Yankee, but then it somehow got applied to people in New England for some reason. And I think it might be because the if I remember correctly, the British regulars referred to Americans and New Englanders especially as Yankees. Now we know the word Yankee is what it refers to changes depending on who's using it. For a Southerner, a Yankee is somebody who lives north of in the north of what used to be called the Mason-Dixon line, which is actually that border between Maryland and Pennsylvania there, that marked the boundary between slave and free states in the early republic. Now, of course, if you're in the Northeast, though, a Yankee was and is somebody from New England. From New England, a Yankee is somebody from Maine, and if you're from Maine, a Yankee is somebody from villages along the eastern coast. So it's a movie with a word with a contested meaning. Anyway, another important factor in the character of North American English was the Scots-Irish people who came and often settled in valleys and rivers in what was called the Piedmont, the area that was between the lowlands of the tidewater of the eastern seaboard and the mountains. And so they became a lot of Scots-Irish who had been subsistence farmers in the old world came over as indentured servants and as field hands for richer English planters. But they ended up getting sort of let go, as it were, and they went back into the hills to sort of make their own way. And the Scots-Irish gave to Appalachian English its distinctive character, which is connected to Ozarks English, but which is distinct from the sort of Eastern Southern accent. We're going to talk a bit more about that. Now, why did the Scots-Irish get kicked out of the Eastern Seaboard and sent into the Appalachians? Well, in part because the people who were planting rice and calico and cotton and sugar on the Eastern Seaboard found a more profitable form of labor in enslaved Africans. And so we can see in certain areas in central Virginia and along the South Carolina coast especially, that there were predominantly African people. Up here it was tobacco growing, and down here it was calico and rice and beginning to be cotton, although the cotton industry would be a bigger thing later on, but during the early Republic and the pre-Civil War period. So there's three waves of settlement. The first, we can say, of the United States by English-speaking people. 3 waves of immigration, of people coming into this country, into this land from somewhere else. And the first, in each has its own sort of effect on the English language and relationship to the development of American English. The first wave is from 1607 to 1790, and that was the settlement of the East Coast by, driven by the English, but also, as we saw, by Africans, by Dutch, by Scots-Irish, and so forth, and Germans. Then in the second wave was from 1790 to 1860, in which the inhabitants of the eastern seaboard start pushing west past the Appalachians into the Ohio Valley, into the Missouri Valley, and after that beyond there. And this is when we get a first wave of European immigration, especially Irish and German. And Irish English would have a strong effect, particularly in the Northeast, Philly, New York, Boston, but also in New Orleans. If you ever heard that kind of weird local New Orleans accent, it's got features of it that sound like Brooklyn, and that's the influence of the large population of Irish that came to New Orleans as a port city. And then, of course, we could speak of the third wave of settlement as being that from the 1865 to the present, in which there is a shift in immigration patterns from Northern Europe to Southern Eastern Europe to Latin America and Asia over time. So in the years after the Civil War, there continued to be a large influx of Germans, of Scandinavians, of Czech people into the northern Great Plains and into the northern Great Lakes, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and all that. And then you start getting waves of people from Italy, from Greece, and so on and so forth, from Poland. And then in the 20th century, of course, we get immigration from everywhere, including increasingly immigration from Latin America and from Asia. Now, I mean, we talk about immigration from Latin America. It's important to remember that during this time, English-speaking Americans immigrated, so to speak, into what was Latin America, if you can call conquest a form of immigration. And in a way it is. Settlement is, at any rate. So let's look very quickly at the colonial period again in just a little bit more detail, because it established enduring regional patterns. The different accents that we find differentiated along the East Coast are based in part on the different accents that we find in England. So that in New England, which is largely Puritan settlers from East Anglia, that's this region over here, and they spoke a non-rhotic form of English, which means they dropped R's off the end of the word. So if you park your car by the harbor, you know, that sort of famous Boston kind of accent, you're carrying over a speech. They were carrying over a speech pattern that goes all the way back to England. The Middle Atlantic, however, is more mixed. There's many Germans and Scots-Irish, and there were also a lot of immigrants to there from southwestern England. And now in southwestern England, and we'll talk about this more in a subsequent video, but southwestern England, Somerset and Dorset and the city of Bristol, they do not do the typical R-dropping thing that we associate with a lot of dialects of British English. They, in fact, pronounce their R's very strongly. And if you've ever watched the Lord of the Rings movies, the actor who plays Sam Gamgee, Mr. Frodo, that's like almost like a parody of a southwestern English accent. It's also, Bristol was a major port city, and so a lot of sailors were from that region as well, British sailors. And so the kind of nautical accent, that sort of pirate accent where they pronounce their R's very strongly, is actually also related to, it's an exaggerated form of that southwestern English accent. And so in the Mid-Atlantic, that R is pronounced very strongly in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and to Maryland. And that became for various reasons, part of standard American English, even as it didn't become part of standard English in the UK. And now in the South Atlantic, especially along the eastern seaboard, the character of English was defined by settlers, agricultural settlers, planters, farmers, entrepreneurs who were from southern and eastern England and from the Midlands, and that was also the kind of a more prestigious upper class kind of standard English dialect, and that did again drop the R's. And so if you think about the sort of old-fashioned Rhett Butler, I don't pronounce the R's at the end of my word because I'm a fancy Southern person kind of accent, that is also based on the fact that there is a lineage between this region of England and this, what we might call a kind of high Southern accent as spoken by the English settlers along the seaboard. But then the Scots-Irish settle away from the coast in the back, so that the kind of western North Carolina, Tennessee accent, the West Virginia accent, they pronounce their R's very hard because they've got that Scots-Irish thing going, and that was a rhotic dialect of English. That is a dialect of English that pronounces the R. That's what we mean by rhotic. So it's interesting how these regions of England and the patterns of settlement and migration from England shaped the regional dialects of American English. Now, before I'm going to end this first part of this video soon, but it's important to mark here. It's important to pay attention to the fact that this was another invasion, just like this was another Anglo-Saxon invasion. This is another movement of English-speaking peoples into a land that was inhabited by people who spoke other languages, not Celtic languages at this point, but one of the hundreds of indigenous American language families. And you can see on this map there were location of the Senecas, the Cayugas, the Onondagas, the Oneidas, and the Mohawks. These were all the Iroquois people. The Delawares here, the Shawnee here in the Ohio Valley, the Cherokee, the Creeks, the Catawbas, and there were natives all through this land, and a lot of them were shoved off early on in the 17th century. You know, and Seth Lear talks in Inventing English about the miraculous thing that Tisquantum, whom the Puritans in that first Thanksgiving encounter already knew English. It's a very fascinating story about why that is, and it's worth reviewing in detail. But it's important to remember that North America was a place that was full of languages. There are 296 indigenous languages north of Mexico. There are 29 language families. Think about that. There's only about 10 in all of Eurasia, but there were 29 language families in North America, and 27 isolates, which is the name for a language like Basque, for example, that's spoken in the Pyrenees Mountains, that doesn't seem to belong to any other language, or doesn't seem to be related to any other language. North America is notable for its linguistic diversity, especially California. As you can see, there's just tons of languages there. This area has 18 language families comprising 74 languages, compared to only 4 families in Europe. 4. Indo-European, Uralic, Turkic, and Afro-Asiatic, and 1 isolate Basque. Hawaii and Alaska have indigenous languages as official languages along with English, in part, I think, because they were settled so late that the kind of brutal things that we did to indigenous people in the 19th and 20th century to try to exterminate their culture and language and folkways was no longer considered acceptable. So you can look into the history of residential schools both in North America, both in Canada and the United States, to look at the intense ways in which we attempted to uproot all of indigenous languages. But even as we talk about the history of English, we have to bear witness to what it replaced and what it in part destroyed. So on that unhappy note, I'm going to end this video, but then we're going to speak in the next video about some of the unique features of North American English and some of the sources of it and how it developed and how specifically it came to be so distinct in some ways from British English especially. So tune into the next video and get at me with any questions you have.